Moonlight spilled through the tall arched windows of Palazzo Vendramin, turning the black and white marble floor into a chessboard of silver and shadow. Masked guests in silk and feathers drifted through the ballroom beyond, but in the small, candlelit salon the air was thick with something far more dangerous than carnival revelry. If you haven't yet subscribed, click that subscribe button now. Don't miss what happens next. Eleanor Vale stood rigid in her simple midnight blue gown, hands clasped so tightly her knuckles had gone white. Across from her, Matteo di Albizzi, tall, dark, immaculate in severe black evening dress, stared at her as though she were an apparition he intended to banish by force of will alone. His storm-gray eyes held disbelief, then cold fury. "No," he said, the single word cutting like a blade. "Absolutely not." Behind them, the Contessa Adriana di Albizzi, 80 years old and still terrifying, leaned on her ebony cane and smiled the thin, satisfied smile of a woman who had just won a war no one else knew was being fought. "Matteo," she said calmly, "I have chosen Miss Eleanor Vale to be your wife. And you, my dear grandson, will give her the fortnight you promised, or forfeit my blessing and the inheritance that comes with it." Eleanor felt the blood drain from her face. 3 years of quiet service, of making herself invisible, and now, named as bride to the man who had never once truly looked at her. The Vaporetto cut through the grey November water like a blade, leaving Venice behind in a haze of mist and church bells. Eleanor Vale stood at the rail, clutching her single valise, the wind-whipping strands of copper hair from beneath her plain felt hat. She was 23 alone, and poorer than anyone aboard could have guessed from the careful neatness of her patched gloves. 3 years earlier, in the autumn of 1925, she had arrived the same way, fleeing London after her father's suicide in the wake of a gambling scandal that had stripped the family of everything but disgrace. A distant cousin had mentioned, in a letter dripping with pity, that the Contessa Adriana di Albizzi sought an English companion, someone educated, discreet, fluent in languages, and, most importantly, without expectations. Eleanor had answered the advertisement with shaking hands, never imagining the reply would come. Now, as the boat nosed toward the private landing stage of Palazzo Vendramin, she felt the old familiar tightening in her chest. The palazzo rose from the canal like something half-dreamed, faded rose brick, Gothic arches, balconies sagging under centuries of salt air. It was beautiful in the way ruined things sometimes are, magnificent, proud, and quietly breaking. A liveried footman waited on the jetty. He took her valise without a word and led her through the water gate into the shadowed androne. The air smelled of damp stone and candle wax. Somewhere above, a clock struck 4, the sound echoing through vaulted corridors as though the house itself were counting her heartbeats. The Contessa received her in the piccolo salotto on the piano nobile, a room of faded crimson damask and Murano chandeliers that had not been lit in years. Adriana di Albizzi sat bolt upright in a high-backed chair, dressed in unrelieved black despite the 20 years since her husband's death. At 77 she was small, bird-boned, terrifying. Her eyes, dark, bright, unblinking, fixed on Eleanor with the precision of a falcon assessing prey. "You are punctual," the Contessa said in perfect, icy English. "That is a beginning. Sit." Eleanor sat. "You understand the position. You will read to me, accompany me on rare outings, manage my correspondence in English and French, and, above all, be silent when silence is required. You will not flirt with my grandsons, borrow my jewels, or imagine yourself my equal. In return you will have a roof, respectable wages, and protection from whatever wolves pursue you in England. Do we understand one another?" "Yes, Contessa." "Good." A pause. "Your father was Viscount Ashley." Eleanor's breath caught. She had not mentioned the title in her letter. "I make it my business to know," Adriana continued. "A foolish man, but your mother was a Beaufort. Breeding shows, even through ruin. You will not disgrace it here." That was the closest thing to kindness Eleanor received that day. Her room lay high under the roof beams, a narrow chamber once occupied by a governess. A single window looked across tiled rooftops to the lagoon. The bed was hard, the wardrobe ample, the silence absolute. She unpacked her few possessions: 3 serviceable dresses, 2 books of poetry, her mother's prayer book, and a photograph of a country house that no longer belonged to anyone she knew, and arranged them with the precision of someone determined to take up as little space as possible. In the weeks that followed, Eleanor learned the rhythms of the palazzo as intimately as its servants did. She rose early, attended the Contessa's toilette, read aloud from whatever novel or newspaper Adriana demanded, usually in French, sometimes in English, never in Venetian dialect. She walked with the old woman along the Zattera when the weather allowed, holding a black parasol against the weak winter sun. She wrote letters to distant cousins in Vienna and London, letters full of polite lies about the Contessa's health and spirits. And she learned invisibility. It was not difficult. The household was large, the servants loyal to Adriana alone. Guests came rarely: an aging Austrian archduchess, a Florentine count with political ambitions, once an American heiress whose laughter grated on the Contessa's nerves. Eleanor poured tea, arranged flowers, faded into tapestried corners when conversation turned to matters above her station. No one asked her opinion. No one noticed when she left a room. Except, perhaps, once. It was spring of 1926. Matteo di Albizzi arrived unannounced from Trieste, where he managed the family's dwindling shipping line. Eleanor had heard of him, the Contessa's only surviving grandson, 30 years old, handsome in photographs, cold in reputation. He stayed 3 days. She saw him first in the great hall, coat flecked with rain, speaking rapid Italian to the steward about cargo manifests. He was taller than she expected, broader, his dark hair too long for fashion, his mouth set in a line that suggested permanent displeasure. When he turned, his eyes, storm-gray, startling, swept over the assembled staff and passed across her as though she were part of the architecture. Later, at dinner, she stood behind the Contessa's chair to serve as needed. Matteo sat opposite his grandmother, arguing quietly about selling 2 elderly steamers. His voice was low, controlled, edged with exhaustion. Once, when Adriana made a particularly cutting remark about his unmarried state, he glanced up, and for a single heartbeat his gaze snagged on Eleanor's. She felt it like a physical touch. Then it was gone, and he returned to his plate as though nothing had happened. She told herself she imagined it. After that, his visits became the secret axis around which her quiet days turned. He came perhaps 4 times a year, always briefly, always preoccupied. She learned the small things: the way he rubbed his temple when frustrated, the rare half-smile he allowed his grandmother when she scored a verbal point, the way he spoke gently to the old boatman who ferried him to the palazzo. She watched from doorways, from behind books, from the shadows of the loggia. And she buried the ache of it so deeply she almost convinced herself it did not exist. By the winter of 1928, Eleanor had perfected her art. She could cross the Sala Portigo unnoticed while guests exclaimed over Tiepolo's on the ceiling. She could stand beside the Contessa at a rare concert in San Vidal and hear nothing of the music because Matteo was in the audience 3 rows ahead. She could smile, nod, vanish. The palazzo itself seemed to conspire in her invisibility. Its mirrors were old and spotted, its corridors dim. Even the famous ballroom, once the wonder of Venice, had not hosted a ball in 30 years. Dust sheets covered the chandeliers like shrouds. Only during Carnival did life flicker briefly, a few masked dinners, a gondola parade viewed from the balconies. Even then, Eleanor remained in the background, adjusting the Contessa's furs, refilling glasses, unseen. On the morning the summons arrived from Trieste, she was in the library cataloguing a crate of books the Contessa had acquired from a bankrupt Venetian prince. The air smelled of leather and decay. Sunlight slanted through cracked shutters, illuminating moats that danced like tiny ghosts. The footman found her there. "Signorina Vale, the Contessa wishes you in the Salotto Rosso." Immediately. Something in his tone made her heart stutter. She smoothed her grey wool dress, her second best, saved for occasions, and followed him down the marble stairs. She did not yet know that everything was about to change. But as she paused on the landing, looking down into the great hall where servants hurried with unnatural urgency, fresh flowers, polished silver, the faint scent of beeswax, she felt the first cold breath of destiny brush the back of her neck. Invisibility, she would soon learn, was a fragile shield, and some eyes, when they finally chose to see, could burn straight through it. The telegram arrived on a morning thick with February fog, the kind that muffled church bells and turned the Grand Canal into a ribbon of pewter. Eleanor was in the Contessa's boudoir, brushing out Adriana's long white hair, still thick and defiant at 80, with the slow, ritual strokes that had become their silent communion. The footman knocked once, entered, and presented the silver tray. A single yellow envelope lay upon it, addressed in the Contessa's severe black script, Matteo di Albizzi, Trieste. Adriana's hand did not tremble as she slit the paper with an ivory stiletto, but Eleanor saw the faint tightening around her mouth. "Read it to me, child," the old woman commanded. Eleanor took the flimsy sheet. "Arriving Friday. Stop. No delays. Stop. Matters of succession cannot wait. Stop. M. Short. Imperious. Utterly Matteo." Adriana leaned back against the lace pillows, eyes half closed like a cat calculating the distance to a particularly elusive bird. "He believes I have chosen Lavinia Rossi," she murmured, almost to herself. "Or perhaps that American heiress with the dreadful laugh. He will come prepared to refuse a suitable bride. How little he understands." Eleanor kept her expression neutral, though her pulse betrayed her. Matteo had not visited since the previous summer. A brief, tense 3 days during which he had argued with his grandmother about selling the last of the sailing fleet and barely spoken 10 words to anyone else. She remembered the way he had stood on the Altana terrace at dusk, staring toward the open lagoon as though it might offer escape. She remembered, too, how carefully she had kept out of his sight. Now he was returning. The palazzo responded as though a long-dormant engine had been stoked. Servants emerged from attics and storerooms like mice scenting cheese. Silver was polished until it blazed. Linen was aired. The great crimson drawing-room, closed for a decade, was opened, its dust sheets removed to reveal faded brocade and a chandelier that wept crystal tears. Flowers arrived from the hothouses on the Lido, forced camellias, early hyacinths, branches of mimosa that perfumed the corridors with improbable spring. Eleanor watched it all from the edges, as always. She helped the housekeeper select the guest suite overlooking the canal, the one with the Tiepolo ceiling and the bed said to have once hosted Casanova. She stood by while the cook pored over French cookbooks, muttering about sauces that required 3 days and ingredients no Venetian market had seen since the war. She noted the nervous excitement in the maid's eyes, the way the footmen straightened their livery with new pride. A great man was coming. The master of the house, even if he rarely occupied it. Only the Contessa remained serene, issuing orders in her dry, precise voice, moving through the chaos like a queen through battle preparations. "You will wear the midnight blue at dinner," she told Eleanor on the evening before Matteo's arrival. "Not the gray. Gray makes you look like a Quaker widow." Eleanor opened her mouth to protest. She possessed exactly one good gown, saved for rare evenings when the Contessa entertained, then closed it. Arguing was futile. Yes, Contessa. Adriana studied her with those sharp, dark eyes. He will be difficult, she said. He always is. But he is my blood, and I have never yet lost an argument with him. Eleanor inclined her head and escaped to her small room under the eaves. There she laid out the blue gown, silk, simple, a gift from Adriana 2 Christmases past, and tried to quiet the treacherous flutter in her chest. She told herself it was merely the disruption of routine. Nothing more. Friday dawned clear and cold, the sky a hard Venetian blue that turned the water to sapphire. By noon the household had assembled in the androne. Butler, housekeeper, maids in starched aprons, footmen rigid as soldiers. Eleanor stood a step behind the Contessa, who waited at the foot of the marble staircase in her finest black lace, cane planted like a standard. The motor launch approached with a low, powerful thrum. Matteo stepped onto the jetty alone. No secretary, no valet, carrying only a single leather valise. He wore a dark overcoat against the wind, collar turned up, hat pulled low. Even from a distance he seemed to carry his own weather, a storm front moving across bright water. He entered the palazzo as though striding onto a battlefield. Na. He bent to kiss the Contessa's cheek with the brief, mechanical courtesy of long habit. His voice was deeper than Eleanor remembered, roughened by sea air and cigarettes. You summoned. I came. I see that. Adriana's tone could have frozen Prosecco. We will speak after you have rested. The blue suite is prepared. I require neither rest nor food. He set the valise down with a decisive thud. I require an explanation. Why have you dragged me from Trieste to announce a bride as though I were still in leading strings? The servants froze. Eleanor felt the air thicken. If you had chosen your own bride in the past decade, Adriana replied coolly, I would not be forced to choose for you. You are 33, Matteo. The line ends with you unless you act. My patience, limited at the best of times, has run out. Matteo's jaw tightened. I have met every eligible woman from here to Naples. I have endured seasons in Rome, winters in Cortina, summers on Capri. I have done everything expected of me except chain myself to some empty-headed heiress whose chief accomplishment is reciting her father's bank balance. I will not be commanded in this. And yet here you are, the Contessa observed, answering my command. Silence stretched, taut as wire. Matteo exhaled through his teeth. Because you are my grandmother, and I owe you respect. But I will not marry whatever porcelain doll you have selected. Present her at dinner. Let this farce begin and end swiftly. He turned toward the staircase without waiting for reply, taking the steps 2 at a time with restless, contained energy. His coat swirled like a cape. Eleanor caught the faint scent of salt and tobacco as he passed, close enough that she could have touched his sleeve if she had dared. The household exhaled as one. Adriana tapped her cane once on the marble. Dinner at 8. And Eleanor, attend me in 1 hour. We have preparations to make. In her narrow room, Eleanor changed into the midnight blue with fingers that would not quite stop trembling. The silk whispered against her skin like a warning. She pinned her copper hair severely, then, on impulse, loosened a few strands to soften the line of her jaw. She told herself it was for the Contessa's sake. Downstairs, the palazzo waited. Candles lit, silver gleaming, flowers breathing their hothouse sweetness into the cold air. Matteo di Albizzi had returned. And somewhere in the quiet machinery of the Contessa's mind, a long-planned wheel had begun to turn. Eleanor descended the servants' stair, heart beating against her ribs like a bird against glass. She did not yet know that tonight, for the first time in 3 years, she would be required to step fully into the light. But she felt it coming, the way sailors feel storms long before the sky darkens. The candles in the Salotto Rosso had been lit an hour early, their flames trembling in the draught from the tall windows that overlooked the canal. Outside, gondolas glided past like black swans, their lanterns winking through the mist. Inside, the air was heavy with beeswax, camellias, and anticipation sharp enough to cut. Eleanor entered at the Contessa's summons, the midnight blue silk whispering around her ankles. She had taken extra care with her hair, pinning it in a low knot that left a few copper tendrils loose at her temples. The gown, though simple, caught the candlelight like dark water. For the first time in 3 years she felt exposed, as though the fabric were too thin to shield her from what was coming. Adriana sat in her customary high-backed chair, black lace severe against the crimson walls. A single lamp burned beside her, throwing her sharp profile into relief. Matteo stood at the window, back rigid, hands clasped behind him. He had changed into evening dress, black coat, white waistcoat, the severe elegance that made lesser men look overdressed. He did not turn when Eleanor entered. "Ah, there you are," the Contessa said. She gestured to the chair opposite her own, not Eleanor's usual small seat by the fire, but the one reserved for equals. "Sit, child. We have been waiting." Eleanor's heart lurched. "We." She glanced at Matteo's immovable back, then at Adriana's calm, implacable face. Understanding began to dawn, cold and terrible. Matteo turned then, slowly, as though the movement cost him. His gray eyes found her across the room and, for the first time in 3 years, truly saw her. The silence stretched until it hummed. Recognition flickered across his features, followed swiftly by disbelief, then something darker. Fury. "No," he said. The word fell into the quiet like a stone into deep water. "Absolutely not." Adriana's cane tapped once against the parquet. "You have not heard my reasons. I do not need to hear them." His voice was low, controlled, lethal. "This," his gesture took in Eleanor, the room, the entire impossible situation. "This is your choice?" Eleanor felt the blood leave her face. She rose without conscious decision, legs unsteady beneath the silk. "Contessa," she began, her voice remarkably steady, "I am deeply grateful for your kindness these 3 years, but I cannot." "You will sit," Adriana interrupted, soft as silk over steel. "Both of you." Matteo's jaw flexed. He did not sit. Adriana continued as though neither had spoken. "Miss Eleanor Vale is the bride I have selected for you, Matteo. She is intelligent, educated, fluent in 4 languages, and of impeccable, if impoverished, lineage. Her mother was a Beaufort. Her father, whatever his failings, was a viscount. She has managed this household with discretion and grace for 3 years. She knows its accounts, its servants, its history better than you do. She is, in every way that matters, the woman you require." Matteo's eyes had not left Eleanor's face. She felt the weight of his scrutiny like a physical force, cold, assessing, finding her wanting. "She is your companion," he said flatly. "A paid employee." Eleanor flinched as though struck. Adriana's gaze glittered. "And what, precisely, do you object to? Her lack of fortune? Her lack of title? Or merely her lack of ornament?" Matteo's silence was answer enough. Eleanor found her voice. "Contessa, I must tender my resignation. Effective immediately." "You will do no such thing." Adriana's tone brooked no argument. "When you arrived here, child, you were 1 step from destitution. Your father's debts had devoured everything. Your home, your prospects, your name. Your mother was my dearest friend at school. I gave you shelter, dignity, purpose. You owe me nothing, but I am asking, as perhaps the last wish of a dying woman, that you grant me this fortnight. You are not dying, Matteo said through gritted teeth. I am 80 years old, Adriana replied. Every breath is borrowed. I will not leave this world knowing the D. Albizzi line ends because my grandson is too proud to marry where his heart might actually be engaged. The breakfast room of Palazzo Vendramin faced southeast, catching the thin February sunlight that slid across the canal like pale gold leaf. Long tables had once groaned here beneath Venetian banquets. Now a single small table was laid near the windows with crisp linen, silver coffee service, and a modest array of rolls, figs, and prosciutto. The Contessa had declared herself indisposed, a diplomatic headache, and taken chocolate in her rooms. Eleanor descended the marble stairs at 8:30, steeling herself for solitude. She had lain awake most of the night, turning the Contessa's impossible scheme over and over like a jagged shell that cut every time she touched it. By dawn she had resolved to endure the fortnight with distant courtesy, speak only when spoken to, and retreat at every opportunity. Invisibility had served her well for 3 years. It would serve her 2 weeks more. She entered the breakfast-room and stopped. Matteo was already there. He stood at the sideboard, pouring coffee with the economical movements of a man accustomed to serving himself on ships. He wore a dark morning coat, collar open, hair still damp from shaving. The light caught the silver threads at his temples that had not been there a year ago. When he turned, the cup paused halfway to his lips. Miss Vale. His voice was carefully neutral, stripped of last night's contempt. I did not expect you. Eleanor recovered her composure and crossed to the table. The Contessa suggested I breakfast here. If you prefer privacy, I can. No, he set the cup down with a soft click. My grandmother has made her wishes clear. We are to become acquainted. The last words carried a faint edge of self-mockery. Retreating to separate rooms would rather defeat the purpose. He gestured to the chair opposite his own, farther apart than strict etiquette demanded, as though distance were a courtesy they both required. Eleanor sat, folding her hands in her lap to hide their tremor. A footman appeared silently, poured her coffee, withdrew. The door closed with discreet finality. Silence stretched, not hostile but watchful, like the pause between thunder and rain. Matteo broke it first. I owe you an apology. She looked up, startled. Last night, he continued, eyes on his plate, I behaved abominably. Whatever my feelings about my grandmother's methods, you did not deserve to be spoken of, or looked at, as though you were an offense. You were ambushed as thoroughly as I was. That is no excuse for my lack of manners, but it is the truth. The words were clipped, formal, yet she heard the effort behind them. You were honest, she said quietly. I would rather honesty than empty courtesy. He gave a short, surprised huff that might have been laughter. Then you are rarer than I thought. Most women prefer the courtesy, empty or not. A footman refilled coffee. They both waited until he withdrew. Matteo leaned back, studying her with a curiosity that felt almost clinical. My grandmother claims you have been here 3 years. I confess I paid shameful little attention. That was rather the intention, Eleanor replied before she could censor herself. A good companion is ornamental only when required, and otherwise unseen. Something flickered in his gray eyes. Amusement? Respect? Gone too quickly to name. And yet my grandmother sees you clearly enough to consider you? He searched for a word that would not wound. Suitable as mistress of this house. Eleanor set her cup down with care. I do not know what she sees, signore. I only know she has been kind to me when the world was not, and that I promised her a fortnight. That promise does not require me to pretend enthusiasm for an outcome neither of us desires. He regarded her for a long moment, fork forgotten. You truly did not know her plan before last night. I truly did not. Her voice was steady, though heat rose in her cheeks. If I had, I would have left before your launch tied up at the jetty. I would have spared us both that scene. The humiliation was mine, he said. My grandmother dangled you like a jest, and I responded as though she had insulted me personally. He shook his head. Whatever this fortnight becomes, you deserve better than to be treated as an embarrassment. The unexpected grace unsettled her more than last night's anger had. Thank you, she managed. They ate in silence for a time, but it was different now, contemplative rather than antagonistic. Eleanor stole glances. The way he frowned slightly at a too-sweet fig, the long fingers that cradled the delicate porcelain cup with absent care, the faint scar along his left jaw she had never noticed before. He caught her looking. She did not flinch. "Tell me something true about yourself," he said suddenly. "Not the polished facts my grandmother recites, lineage, languages, reduced circumstances. Something real." The request was a trap, yet his eyes held only genuine interest. She considered. "I prefer books to people," she said at last. "Not because I dislike people, but because books do not judge. I have read every volume in the library twice, some 3 times, because I feared one day I might not have access to them again." "You expected to leave." "I expect nothing." The honesty surprised her. "I have learned that expectations invite disappointment. But I love the smell of the lagoon at dawn, when the city is still asleep. I love the way light falls through the library windows in October. And I love your grandmother's sharp tongue. It reminds me of my mother, who could silence a room with one raised eyebrow." A faint smile touched his mouth, the first she had ever seen directed at her. It transformed his severe features in a way that made her breath catch. "Your mother sounds formidable." She was. She died before. Everything fell apart. She was spared the worst. He nodded slowly. "Loss leaves its mark." They finished the meal in quieter silence. When he set down his napkin, he fixed her with a steady look. "I should tell you something, Miss Vale." "Yes." "I came here intending to sabotage this fortnight. I agreed to honest effort, planning all the while to demonstrate, politely, coldly, that my grandmother's choice was impossible, to force her to withdraw gracefully." Eleanor kept her expression neutral, though the admission stung. Of course he had never intended to consider her. "I am telling you this," he continued, "because I no longer intend that course." His gaze did not waver. "You are not what I expected. You are direct, intelligent, apparently unafraid to speak plain truth to a man who has given you every reason to fear his temper. I do not know if my grandmother is right about compatibility, but I know I owe you more than a charade designed to make you fail." Her heart beat hard against her ribs. "What are you proposing?" "Nothing so grand as a proposal." The ghost of a smile again. "I propose we spend this fortnight as she intended, honestly. That we come to know each other without agenda. That we discover whether anything real exists between us, or whether we part at the end with mutual relief." Eleanor stared at him, the breakfast-room suddenly too bright, the canal outside glittering like shattered glass. "You are willing," she said slowly, "to genuinely consider me." "I am willing to see you," he corrected. "The rest will follow, or it will not." He rose, tension visible in the set of his shoulders despite the measured words. "I cannot promise more. I have reasons to be wary. But I can promise to try. And I have not made that promise to any woman in years." He left before she could answer, footsteps echoing down the corridor until the palazzo swallowed them. Eleanor remained at the table long after the coffee had gone cold. Outside, a gondola passed beneath the windows, its oarsman singing a fragment of Verdi into the bright morning. The notes drifted up, fragile and beautiful and impossible to hold. Hope, dangerous, long-buried hope, stirred in her chest like a bird testing its wings. She tried to crush it. It refused to die. Carnival had descended upon Venice like a fever dream. For 10 days the city shed its somber winter skin and dressed itself in silk, feathers, and lies. Bridges and campi filled with masked figures, harlequins in diamond patchwork, doctors in long-nosed plague masks, women in glittering botta and moretta who moved like conspirators through the calle. Music spilled from every palazzo. Gondolas crowded the smaller canals until their prows kissed like courting swans. At Palazzo Vendramin the great ballroom, silent for 30 years, was opened at last. Dust sheets vanished, chandeliers were lowered and washed until they blazed like frozen waterfalls. The Contessa, claiming renewed vigor, announced a masked dinner for the Thursday of Carnival, followed by a small ball. Invitations went out to 20 carefully chosen families. Old Venetian nobility, a few foreign diplomats, one American industrialist whose dollars might salvage the D. Albizzi shipping line. Eleanor understood the strategy at once. The Contessa intended to display her chosen bride in public, force Matteo into her company under the guise of hospitality, and let society's curious gaze do part of the work. She spent the week in a whirl of fittings and instructions. A dressmaker arrived from Milan with bolts of silk the color of midnight and moonlit water. Gowns were pinned, altered, repinned until Eleanor barely recognized the woman in the mirror, a stranger with elegant shoulders and a waist defined by cunning seams. The Contessa inspected each creation with hawkish approval. "You will not hide," she told Eleanor one afternoon, cane tapping for emphasis. "Not in gray, not in corners, not behind fans. You will wear the silver mask with the sapphire stars. You will dance. And you will remember that a D. Albizzi bride does not apologize for existing." Eleanor tried to protest. Adriana silenced her with a look. Matteo, meanwhile, made good on his breakfast-room promise. He sought her out, not with dramatic gestures, but with quiet persistence. A walk along the Zattera at low tide to watch the mudlarks. An hour in the library discussing a new treatise on steam propulsion. He listened to her opinions on engineering as though they mattered. One evening he appeared in the small salon while she read aloud to the Contessa and remained after Adriana retired, asking questions about the novel until the candles burned low. He watched her, yes, but always with a measured distance, as though she were a painting he had not yet decided to purchase. The night of the ball arrived crisp and star-drunk. Eleanor stood before her mirror in the new chambers the Contessa had quietly moved her into, a proper guest suite on the piano nobile, with windows onto the canal and a bed wide enough for secrets. The gown was silver tissue over smoke-blue silk, cut low across the shoulders, shimmering like canal water under torches. The mask covered only her eyes and upper cheeks, leaving her mouth free. Sapphires winked at the brow like captured stars. She looked, she thought with a pang, almost beautiful. Downstairs, the palazzo blazed with light. Guests arrived by gondola, cloaks swirling as footmen handed them onto the jetty. Music floated up, violins, a harpsichord, the low throb of a double bass. Eleanor descended the great staircase slowly, one gloved hand on the marble balustrade, feeling every eye turn upward. Matteo waited at the foot. He wore severe black relieved only by a silver waistcoat and a plain black botta that concealed most of his face. Yet she knew him instantly. The height, the breadth of shoulder, the impatient energy barely leashed. When she reached the last step, he offered his arm without a word. His sleeve brushed her bare skin. Warmth radiated through layers of silk and wool. "You are punctual," he murmured. The mask muffled his voice, made it intimate. "Your grandmother trained me well." A faint curve of his mouth, the closest he came to smiling in public. They moved through the receiving line together, the Contessa presiding like a black-clad spider at the center of her web. Whispers followed them. "Who is the Englishwoman in silver?" "The companion, they say." "Impossible. Look how he keeps her close." Matteo did keep her close. He introduced her as Miss Vale, my grandmother's ward, a formulation that raised eyebrows and silenced questions. When the orchestra struck up a waltz, he led her onto the floor without asking permission, one hand firm at her waist, the other clasping hers as though it belonged there. They danced well together, surprisingly well. He was a strong lead. She followed instinctively, years of lessons in a happier life resurfacing like muscle memory. Around them masks swirled in eddies of color, but Eleanor saw only the storm-gray eyes behind his botta. "You dance as though you were born to it," he said quietly. "My mother insisted." She believed a woman should know how to move through the world gracefully, even if the world intended to trip her. His grip tightened fractionally. "And has the world tripped you often?" "Often enough." The music ended. Applause rippled. He did not release her immediately. Across the room, a new arrival caused a stir. A woman in cloth of gold, mask a sunburst of gilded rays, descended the staircase on the arm of an older woman whose diamonds could have ransomed a principality. Even masked, her beauty was unmistakable. Tall, golden-haired, moving with the confidence of someone accustomed to being the center of every orbit. Lavinia Rossi, the heiress the Contessa had paraded as a possible bride the previous spring. The one Matteo had dismissed with icy politeness. Lavinia's gaze found them across the ballroom and sharpened. She smiled, a dazzling, predatory smile, and began threading through the crowd toward them. Matteo's posture changed, subtle but unmistakable. The hand at Eleanor's waist withdrew. "Excuse me," he said, voice suddenly formal. "I should greet our new guests." He walked away without looking back. Eleanor stood alone in a sea of masks, feeling the silver tissue suddenly cold against her skin. Around her conversation hummed, laughter rose and fell, but she felt every stare like pinpricks. The Contessa appeared at her elbow as though conjured. "Steady, child," she murmured. "This is the test. Do not let them see you bleed." Lavinia reached them moments later, trailed by her mother, a formidable woman built like a galleon under full sail. "Contessa Adriana." Lavinia's voice was honey over broken glass. "How splendid to see the palazzo alive again. And this must be your charming companion I have heard so much about." Her eyes flicked over Eleanor's gown, the sapphires, the place at Matteo's side she had occupied moments before. "Miss Vale," the Contessa said coolly, "allow me to present Signorina Lavinia Rossi and her mother, Contessa Rossi." Eleanor curtsied with perfect composure. "An honor." Lavinia's smile widened. "The honor is mine." One hears such stories, penniless English roses plucked from ruin by generous patronesses. How romantic! The insult was velvet-sheathed, impossible to parry without seeming petty. Eleanor felt heat rise in her cheeks but kept her voice level. Romance is perhaps too strong a word. Gratitude, certainly. And hard work. Indeed. Lavinia turned to the Contessa. "And dear Matteo, where has he vanished to? I had so hoped for a dance. We shared several last season in Rome. He was quite attentive." The lie hung glittering in the air. The Contessa's cane tapped once. "My grandson is attending to his duties as host. I am certain he will find you later." But Matteo did not return. Eleanor saw him across the room, trapped in conversation with Lavinia's mother, his posture rigid courtesy. Lavinia herself claimed the next dance with a handsome Austrian attaché, laughing too loudly, her gold mask catching every light. The evening fractured into fragments: forced smiles, polite refusals of dances, the slow realization that Matteo's brief warmth had retreated behind familiar walls. When the orchestra played a quadrille, Eleanor retreated to an alcove shadowed by potted palms. She watched the masked figures whirl and wondered how many hearts besides her own were breaking beneath feathers and guilt. Much later, when the guests had gone and the chandeliers were extinguished one by one, she climbed the stairs alone. The silver gown felt heavy now, the mask a weight across her eyes. In her new chambers she removed the sapphires, unpinned her hair, let it fall in copper waves down her back. The mirror showed a woman flushed and weary, eyes too bright. She had been visible tonight, gloriously, terrifyingly visible. And still, when the rival appeared, he had walked away. Down the corridor, in the library, Matteo poured himself a grappa he did not drink. He stared at the black canal, replaying the moment he had abandoned Eleanor on the dance floor. Cowardice, plain and simple. Lavinia's beauty had always left him unmoved, but her mother's ambition, and the memories of past sieges, had triggered old defenses. He had seen Eleanor's face across the room afterward, composed, pale, utterly alone amid the revelry. He had promised honesty. Instead he had given her the cut indirect. The grappa trembled in his glass. 2 weeks, he had agreed. 9 days remained. He set the glass down untouched and stood at the window until dawn began to pale the sky, wrestling with the unfamiliar ache in his chest that had Eleanor Vale's name written all through it. March arrived in Venice like a thief, bringing the treacherous spring tides known as aqua alta. 4 days the sirocco wind blew warm and wet from the south, pushing the Adriatic into the lagoon. The city watched the water rise with the fatalism of an old lover who knows the quarrel will end in tears. On the 3rd morning the sirens sounded, the low, mournful warning that told Venetians to lift furniture, don boots, and prepare for flooding. By noon the narrower Calli were rivers. Piazza San Marco gleamed like a dark mirror. The palazzo's ground floor began to take water through the Androne, lapping at the ancient stone with patient hunger. Matteo stood on the jetty in oilskins, directing launches loaded with sandbags and pumps. The shipping company's men, hardened sailors from Trieste, worked alongside the palazzo staff, ferrying the poorest families from the drowned sestiere of Castello and Dorsoduro. The Contessa had opened the piano nobile to those displaced, mattresses laid in the ballroom, soup kettles steaming in the great kitchen. Eleanor watched from the water-gate, skirts kirtled up, boots borrowed from a maid. She had spent the dawn helping servants move tapestries and books to higher floors. Now she saw children shivering in gondolas, old women clutching bundles that held their entire lives, and felt the old helplessness rise like the tide. "I am going with you," she told Matteo as he prepared to shove off in the largest launch. He turned, rain streaking his face. "Absolutely not. The streets are waist-deep in places. Stay here where it is safe." Safe. She gestured to the rising water that already swirled around the jetty pilings. "These people know me. I have visited their homes, brought the Contessa's baskets at Christmas, listened to their stories. They will trust me. You need someone who speaks their dialect, who knows which families have infants, which have elderly who cannot walk far." His jaw tightened. "I need you alive. And I need to be useful." She met his eyes without flinching. If you want to know who I truly am, Matteo, know this: I will not stand idle while people drown." Something shifted in his expression. Surprise, admiration, fear. "You stay at my side," he said finally. "You follow my orders without question. If I say take shelter, you do it." Agreed. They went out together into the storm. The hours dissolved into cold, wet chaos. Eleanor directed the men to the cortile, where old Signora Balbi clung to her cat and refused to leave without it. To the crumbling casa, where 3 small brothers huddled on a table as water rose around them. She organized makeshift shelters in the upper floors of palazzi whose owners had fled to the mainland, distributed blankets, calmed a hysterical mother whose baby had a fever. Matteo watched her move through the flood with quiet authority. Sleeves rolled high, copper hair plastered to her cheeks, voice steady in Venetian dialect as she coaxed, commanded, comforted. This was no drawing-room charity. This was competence forged in hardship, leadership born of necessity. By dusk the worst had passed in the higher districts, but the lower sestiere remained treacherous. Their launch ran aground near a flooded campo. The bridge to the palazzo was impassable. The only dry refuge was an abandoned palazzo on the Rio di San Polo, its owner long bankrupt, its upper floors still above water. They climbed the exterior staircase slick with algae, helping the last family, a grandmother and 2 grandchildren, inside. The great salon on the second floor was eerily intact. Faded frescoes of gods and nymphs gazing down on empty air, a single vast bed shrouded in Holland cloth, a hearth where centuries of fires had blackened the stone. Matteo built a fire with broken furniture and a flask of grappa for kindling. The flames caught, throwing restless shadows across peeling silk walls. Outside, the wind howled and water lapped at the windows below. They were alone. Eleanor knelt to warm her hands, shivering in her sodden cloak. Matteo shrugged out of his oilskin and draped it around her shoulders without asking. It smelled of salt and him. "We will stay here until morning," he said. "The tide turns at dawn." She nodded, teeth chattering. He sat beside her on the hearthrug, not touching, but close enough that warmth began to seep through layers of wet wool. "You were magnificent today," he said quietly. "I have commanded men on ships in storms, but I have never seen anyone lead as you did. I only did what needed doing. You did more." His voice was rough. "You knew every name, every child's fear, every old woman's pride. You turned panic into order without raising your voice." She looked at him then, firelight gilding the planes of his face. "I learned from watching you, from watching your grandmother, from surviving things that taught me people matter more than pride." He reached out, brushed a wet strand of hair from her cheek. His fingers lingered. "Eleanor." The word was a confession. She turned into his touch. "Matteo." He kissed her as though he had been drowning and she was air. There was no gentleness in it at first, only hunger held back too long. His hands framed her face, slid into her hair, pulled her closer until she was straddling his lap on the threadbare rug, mouths fused, breath shared. The fire crackled. Outside the storm raged. Inside everything narrowed to heat and need and the taste of salt on his skin. When they broke apart, foreheads pressed together, both were trembling. "I have wanted this," he whispered against her lips, "since the morning you laughed at my terrible coffee and refused to flatter me. I have wanted you every day since, and fought it because I was afraid." "Afraid of what?" "Of feeling again. Of being the fool I was 7 years ago." His hands tightened on her waist. "But you are not her. You never were. You see me, all of me, and you stay." She kissed him this time, slower, deeper, a promise rather than a plea. They did not make love on the cold floor. Some remnant of propriety, or perhaps simple exhaustion, held them back. Instead they lay side by side before the fire, wrapped in his oilskin and her cloak, talking as the flames burned low. He told her about the woman who had wounded him, her laughter overheard in a Rome garden, the way it had frozen something vital inside him. He told her about the nights at sea when he had stared at black water and wondered if he was capable of warmth any more. She told him about her father's rages, the way he had called her worthless to her face, the morning she had found him dead at his desk with a pistol and a pile of unpaid bills. She told him about arriving in Venice, convinced she would never again be more than a shadow. "I thought invisibility was safety," she said, her head on his chest, listening to his heartbeat. "You taught me it was only half a life." His arms tightened around her. "And you taught me that risking the heart is the only way to truly live." Outside, the wind began to ease. Somewhere a church bell tolled the hour, distant, muffled by water. "Dawn soon," he murmured. She lifted her head. And then I tell my grandmother the fortnight is unnecessary. I tell Lavinia Rossi and her mother to leave my house. I tell Venice, and the world if it cares, that I am marrying you because I love you, not because I was commanded, because I cannot imagine a future without you in it." Tears pricked her eyes. "You love me. I love you." He said it fiercely, as though defying the storm itself. "I love your courage and your sharp mind and the way you say my name like it matters. I love the woman who wades into floods to save strangers and still blushes when I look at her too long. Marry me, Eleanor. Not for the Contessa. For us." She kissed him again, tears salt on their lips. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes." The fire burned to embers. Outside, the first pale light touched the waterlogged city. In the ruined palazzo, two people held each other through the fading night, wounded, healed, remade. When dawn came, they returned to Palazzo Vendramin hand in hand, soaked and exhausted and radiant. The tide had turned. So had everything else. The launch cut through the receding water at mid-morning, its engine a low growl against the strangely quiet city. Venice lay stunned in the aftermath of the Acqua Alta, streets strewn with debris, facades streaked with tide marks, gondolas grounded like beached whales. Yet the sun shone with merciless clarity, turning every puddle into a mirror. Matteo and Eleanor stood side by side at the prow, hands linked beneath the fold of his oilskin. Neither had slept. Both glowed with a reckless, exhausted joy. Her copper hair had dried in wild waves. His coat hung open, collar askew. They looked like survivors of a shipwreck who had discovered treasure on the same shore that nearly drowned them. As the palazzo came into view, Eleanor felt the first tremor of reality. The Contessa would be waiting. Lavinia and her mother would be waiting. Venice, gossiping, judging, weighing, would be waiting. Matteo squeezed her hand. "Whatever comes," he said quietly, "we face it together." The household greeted their return with barely concealed curiosity. Servants darted glances at their linked hands, the unmistakable intimacy of two people who had spent a night alone in circumstances no chaperone could sanction. Whispers followed them up the marble stairs like ripples. The Contessa received them in the Salotto Rosso, seated in her high-backed chair like a judge on the bench. Lavinia and Contessa Rossi stood behind her, summoned, it seemed, for an accounting of the flood's damage. Lavinia's golden beauty looked brittle in the morning light. Her mother's face was thunderous. Adriana's sharp eyes took in everything. The mud on Eleanor's hem, Matteo's protective stance, the new steadiness in Eleanor's gaze. "Well," the old woman said dryly, "you both appear to have survived the deluge. I trust the city's unfortunates fared as well." "They did," Matteo replied. "Thanks, in large part, to Eleanor." Lavinia's smile was thin. "How heroic! One hears the most dramatic tales of ladies wading through floods. Though perhaps a trifle imprudent for an unmarried woman to spend the night abroad with a gentleman." Contessa Rossi seized the opening. "Indeed. Tongues will wag, Contessa Adriana. Your companion's reputation, fragile as it already is, may not recover. And Matteo's honor. My honor is intact, Matteo cut in, voice like tempered steel. And Eleanor's reputation is now my concern. He stepped forward, bringing Eleanor with him. Nana, I have come to end the farce of the fortnight. Your scheme, brilliant, infuriating, and entirely successful, has achieved its purpose. Adriana's brows rose. Has it? It has. He turned to face the room fully, keeping Eleanor's hand firmly in his. I am marrying Eleanor Vale. Not because you commanded it. Not because duty or inheritance demands it. But because I love her, and I will not spend another day without her as my wife. Silence crashed through the salon like breaking glass. Lavinia went white beneath her rouge. Her mother's mouth opened and closed soundlessly. Eleanor felt tears threaten, not of fear now, but of overwhelming relief. She squeezed Matteo's hand, anchoring herself. Contessa Rossi recovered first. This is absurd. She is a nobody, a paid companion with a scandalous family. Venice will laugh you out of the palazzo. The king himself. The king, Adriana interrupted mildly, is in Rome and has no say in who my grandson weds. As for Venice laughing, Venice has laughed at D. Albizzi choices for 6 centuries and survived. Lavinia found her voice, shrill with disbelief. You cannot prefer her over me. Over everything I represent, connections, fortune, position. I prefer truth over performance, Matteo said. I prefer a woman who risks her life for strangers over one who risks nothing but her pride. I prefer Eleanor. The words rang with finality. Contessa Rossi drew herself up. Then we have been misled. Lavinia, we are leaving. But Lavinia did not move. Her beautiful face twisted with something ugly. You will regret this, she spat at Eleanor. He will tire of playing savior to a penniless nobody. When the novelty wears thin. Enough. Matteo's voice cracked like a whip. The room stilled. If you haven't subscribed yet, click the subscribe button now before this escalates. He turned to his grandmother. Nana, I believe we have a scandal to manage. Adriana's lips curved in pure satisfaction. Indeed we do. Though perhaps not the one our guests imagine. As if on cue, the door opened. The butler entered, followed by a young man in travel-stained clothes, dark-haired, handsome, flushed with urgency. Signor Leonardo Rossi, the butler announced. Lavinia blanched. 7 years later, spring 1935. The palazzo had changed, and yet it had not. The same rose-brick facade rose from the canal, softened now by climbing jasmine and the gentle wear of additional tides. The great ballroom, once shrouded in dust sheets, rang regularly with music, though never the frantic jazz of the mainland. Matteo drew the line at anything that might scandalize the neighbors. The library shelves groaned under new acquisitions. Treatises on modern shipping, volumes of poetry Eleanor could not resist, and an ever-growing collection of children's books with bright bindings and dog-eared pages. From the Altana Terrace, the high rooftop platform where Venetian women once bleached their hair in the sun, Eleanor watched 3 small figures chase soap bubbles across the piazza below. Alessandro, 6 years old and heir to everything, brandished a wooden sword with solemn chivalry. Twin 4-year-old girls, Adriana and Beatrice, named for the formidable great-grandmother who still ruled the household from her chair, shrieked with delight as bubbles burst against their dark curls. Matteo's launch nosed into the private jetty, returning from a morning at the Arsenal overseeing the refit of a new motor vessel. He stepped onto the stone in shirt-sleeves, coat slung over one shoulder, hair ruffled by the breeze. Even from this height Eleanor could see the silver at his temples had advanced, but it only made him more himself. The severe lines of his face softened by laughter he no longer tried to suppress. He looked up, as he always did, and found her instantly. His smile, the one that had once been so rare, flashed bright as sunlight on water. He raised a hand in greeting, then disappeared beneath the androne to be mobbed by his children before he reached the stairs. Eleanor leaned on the warm terracotta balustrade, feeling the familiar swell of contentment that still surprised her on quiet mornings. She wore a simple linen dress the color of the lagoon at noon. The famous D. Albizzi sapphires rested in their case downstairs. On her finger gleamed only the plain gold band Matteo had placed there in a quiet ceremony in the abandoned Palazzo Chapel on Torcello, witnessed by the Contessa, 2 fishermen, and a priest who asked no questions. The marriage had caused the predicted storm. Venice gossiped for a season. The ice prince wedded to his grandmother's companion, the English nobody elevated to one of the oldest names in the Golden Book. Invitations were withheld. Doors closed. But doors opened too, those of people who valued competence over pedigree, who had watched Eleanor organize relief during the Great Flood and never forgotten it. And Matteo's shipping line, modernized with her quiet suggestions and his relentless drive, began to prosper again. Money, as always, silenced many critics. The Contessa, now 87 and frail but undimmed, had outlived the scandal and most of its architects. She spent her days in the small salon, surrounded by great-grandchildren who climbed her like a beloved tree, dictating letters to Eleanor with the same imperious precision she had once used on secretaries. That afternoon, as the children napped and the city shimmered in heat, Eleanor found Adriana dozing in her chair by the open window. The old woman's hand rested on a half-written letter. Her breathing was light but steady. Eleanor paused in the doorway, struck anew by gratitude. This woman had seen her when she was invisible, had gambled a dynasty's pride on the belief that love and worth were not measured by dowries or bloodlines. Adriana's eyes opened, still sharp, still dark. "You are staring, child," she said without moving. "I am counting my blessings," Eleanor replied softly. "They all begin with you." A faint smile curved the old woman's mouth. "Flattery. But I will accept it. Come, sit. Tell me how the new ship performs." They spoke of tonnage and routes until Matteo joined them, fresh from bathing the twins' sticky hands. He kissed his grandmother's cheek with the easy affection that had once been foreign to him, then settled beside Eleanor on the settee, his arms sliding naturally around her waist. Alessandro burst in moments later, sword abandoned, clutching a drawing of a ship with improbably large sails. "Na, look. Papa says when I am big I can sail to America." Adriana examined the drawing with grave attention. A fine vessel, though perhaps fewer cannons next time. The twins followed, sleepy and demanding stories. Soon the salon filled with the comfortable chaos of family. Children sprawled across laps, Matteo's low voice reading from a book of Venetian legends, Adriana's occasional dry interjections that made the older ones giggle. Later, when the sun dipped and the children were carried off to bed, Matteo and Eleanor stood on the terrace again. The lagoon stretched before them, rose-gold in the dying light. Gondolas glided below like black swans. Somewhere a tenor practiced scales that floated up on the warm air. Matteo's arms came around her from behind, chin resting on her hair. "Happy?" he asked quietly, the ritual question he still asked when the world felt too good to trust. "Impossibly," she answered, the ritual reply. He turned her to face him. The severe lines of his face had eased over the years. Laughter had etched new paths beside his eyes. "I was thinking today," he said, "about the man who stepped off the launch that February morning. Angry. Frozen. Certain he would never risk his heart again." Eleanor traced the scar along his jaw, the one she had kissed 1,000 times. And I was thinking of the woman who waited on the jetty in grey wool, convinced she would always be invisible. They smiled at each other, marveling as they often did at the distance traveled. "You saved me," he said simply. "We saved each other." Below them, the city began to light its lamps, one by one, golden reflections trembling on black water. Venice, eternal survivor of floods and empires, sieges and plagues, cradled them in its ancient arms. In the salon behind them, Adriana set aside her embroidery and allowed herself a small, satisfied smile. Her grandson laughed easily now. Her great-grandchildren filled the palazzo with life. The woman she had chosen, quiet, steady, extraordinary, wore the de Albizzi name with grace that silenced the last whispers. Her work was done. She rang for tea, and for the nurse to bring the baby, little Vittoria, born just that winter, for one more story before sleep. Outside, night settled soft as velvet. Inside, the palazzo glowed with light and voices and the particular warmth that comes when wounds have healed into strength. Eleanor leaned into her husband's embrace, listening to the heartbeat she knew better than her own. She had been invisible once. Now she was seen, truly, wholly, forever. And the joy of it, even after all these years, still took her breath away.